Just before we get into today's video, let me thank today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with thousands of classes in design, business, and more. We've talked about Skillshare a few times on this channel and mentioned various courses and things you can learn on that platform. But maybe you haven't got Skillshare yet and you are totally skillless. That's a great shame, because there are thousands of classes on Skillshare for you to level up your design, your business, your video, your social media, whatever skills it is you want to improve. Or just take from nothing to something. You can do that too. At a time when so many important conversations are happening in our world, your voice is more essential than ever. Explore classes to unlock your creativity for social good. Here in VisualPolitik, we've taken video production courses, camera courses, loads of YouTubey stuff, and we also want to squeeze as much out of our day as possible. So we watched this course by a guy called Thomas Frank, who's also a YouTuber, on getting more stuff done in a day. It's great stuff and worth checking out if you want to be more productive. So yes, Skillshare, just go do it. You'll like it. It's also free for 2 months, so you can try it out, and I'm pretty sure you'll continue your membership because it is so great. Support VisualPolitik by supporting Skillshare. For a limited time, use the link in the description to get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. We warn you that this video may hurt your sensibilities and cause you a strong sense of indignation. In it, we are going to talk about the royal house with possibly the most reprehensible and despotic behaviour in the entire world. Certain royals from my country's own reprehensible behaviour notwithstanding. We are going to tell you how a sultan has turned his people into a kind of cash cow that he milks relentlessly. Are you ready? If so, let's get started. If I ask you to think of a country in Southeast Asia, other than Singapore, and that has a GDP per capita similar to that of Spain or South Korea, what country would you think of? I'll give you a few seconds. 3, 2, 1. Any ideas? I'm sure very few of you would have thought of Brunei. That is, if you haven't already read the title of this video, which admittedly is a little bit of a giveaway. And it's very unlikely that the vast majority of you have heard of this small country nestled on the island of Borneo and surrounded by territories belonging to the Malaysian Federation. After all, it's not only small in terms of territory, but also in population. The country, officially known as the State of Brunei Darussalam, has barely 500,000 inhabitants. In any case, despite not being well known, we are talking about one of the countries with the highest wealth per capita ratios in the world. Its oil and gas reserves are relatively huge, and Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah has been able to take advantage of them. Oil and liquefied natural gas, which they also process, generate more than half of the nation's GDP. What's more, most of these resources are extracted from its exclusive economic zone at sea, giving Brunei one of the best preserved natural environments on the face of the planet. So far, things sound pretty good, right? But hold on just one moment, because you already know that all that glitters is not gold, and this couldn't be more true than in the case of Brunei. Despite being such a wealthy country, the reality is that Bruneians, they enjoy a fairly average standard of living. The thing is though, national bank balances aside, if we're talking about freedoms or human rights, it's not just that this Asian country's track record is poor, it's that it keeps getting worse. But having said that, I'm sure you already have a few questions. Questions like, if this sultanate is apparently so rich, what happens to all the money that Brunei citizens just don't see? What is happening politically in the country so that, unlike most of the rest of the world, civil rights and freedoms are actually in decline? Well, my visual politicos, in this video we are going to answer those two questions, and we are going to tell you some things about the most extreme eccentricities and the most totalitarian leanings of the current sultan. Are you ready? If so, let's go to Brunei. But not really, because their human rights are appalling.
The Wasteful Sultanate.
What you are going to see next is a story that seems to be taken entirely from a Hollywood movie. You know, it's one of those stories of mega wealthy sultans who surround themselves with the most extravagant luxuries you can possibly imagine, and who even have a harem of women all to themselves. You know, like Hollywood movies or that dream I had last night. Well, that's not too far off what the current royal house of Brunei has become. A royal house that not only likes to own things, but also likes to flaunt them. Take, for example, the 14 million gold Rolls-Royce limousine owned by Sultan Hassan Al. And no, don't think that's the only expensive car he keeps in his garage. Not by a long shot. In fact, it is estimated that the royal house has more than 7,000 vehicles at its disposal. We are talking about a fleet with an estimated value of around, wait for it, $5 billion in cars alone. That's right, $5 billion with a B. Of course, we are talking about a sultan whose wealth is estimated to be more than $20 billion. To give you an idea, that figure is much, much higher than the entire gross domestic product of the entire country. In fact, if we take into account that the country's GDP is around about 13.5 billion, this means that the sultan's fortune is almost 50% greater. To give you an example of what that's like, that would be equivalent to, I don't know, the British royal family managing a wealth of almost $4 trillion with a T. That's more than the entire GDP of Germany. And that is nuts. The fact is that among the immense inventory that makes up the Sultan's assets, we can find 10 luxury yachts, at least 17 airplanes, and more than 150 mansions in 12 different countries. And that is not all. As if these assets were not enough of a display of ostentation and luxury, this Sultan lives in the largest private palace in the world. A palace that has no less than 1,788 rooms, 257 bathrooms, 5 swimming pools, its own private mosque, and a garage for 110 of its thousands of cars, along with many other features. For example, the entire palace is lined with 38 types of Italian marble, Shanghai granite, English crystals, and Indian silk decorations. In other words, we are talking about a guy who does not skimp when it comes to luxury. To illustrate this, during his wildest days, when he was just a little younger, it's estimated that the Sultan spent almost $750,000 a day for 10 years. Of course, it's not all about flashing the luxury goods. The Sultan also has his business side. For example, he even has his own hotel chain. Well, technically, the chain, the Dorchester Collection, is owned by the country's sovereign fund, a fund that in turn depends on the Ministry of Finance, which, surprise surprise, is run by Sultan Hassan Al himself. Let's just say that in Brunei there is basically no difference between the public patrimony and the patrimony of the royal house. Or, rather, that in this sultanate, the public patrimony belongs to the royal house. Of course, all this immense fortune is not only enjoyed by the Sultan, but also by his entire family, who, by the way, don't hold back in exhibiting that wealth on social media networks. In fact, his 10th child is quite the Instagram star. With more than 2 million followers on Instagram, young Mateen, at just 29 years old, doesn't hold back in showing his helicopter flights, his parachute drops, his yachting, his love of polo, or his travels around the world by private jet. And if I sound a little bitter, that's because I am. I'd hardly have any Instagram followers. If you want to follow me, I'm at the Grantichrist. Please do, I crave validation. Having said that, you've got to hand this to them, because these are clearly productive people. They're more than productive, they're super productive. I mean, think of all the things they manage to pack into their days. Well, I'm here, just recording videos. But as you know, VisualPolitik is not a celebrity gossip show. If we tell you all these things, it's simply to get ourselves a little better situated. Because keep one thing in mind, Brunei is not just any country, and neither is the Sultan just any Sultan. Hassan Al is considered one of the last absolute monarchs of the 21st century and is the second longest ruling monarch, surpassed only by the Queen of England, who we all know will never die. To be more precise, he has been on the throne since 1967. And take note, because he is not only the Sultan, he also holds the positions of Prime Minister, Minister of Defence, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. And who knows, maybe during the making of this video, he's put himself in charge of yet another ministry, like the Ministry of Polo or Yachting or having too many cars. So yeah, the government is basically just him. Can you imagine a meeting of the executive? It's basically one of those houses of mirrors that you get in the circus. And let's just say that between the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there will always be a consensus, because it is pretty difficult not to agree with yourself. The Ministers' Council sessions must be pretty boring. In short, this is an example of what absolute power looks like. Now, at this point, I'm sure many of you are thinking, okay, this man must be the typical despot who rolls in dollar bills at night while his people starve, right? Well, the truth is, no, not really. At least, not completely. The economic system developed in Brunei is anything but typical. Brunei is the textbook definition of a rentier welfare state. But let me explain. The Royal House of Brunei buys the loyalty and silence of the people in exchange for certain services, which are, of course, trifles compared to the potential wealth that its citizens should enjoy, considering the immense riches of the country. So, how do they get away with it? Well, let's take a look. Because basically, the Brunei government uses a small part of its oil and gas revenues to ensure that its 460,000 inhabitants do not lack the basics, and the rest they keep for themselves. In this way, they can continue to live like gods, without risking that the people will rebel against them due to hunger or poverty, or even question the unethical behaviours of their leaders. So basically, what they do is they throw the citizens a few perks, some crumbs from the table if you will, and they also rule with an iron fist. Because if there is one thing that is expressly forbidden above all others in Brunei, it is speaking ill of the royal family. But be careful though, because when we say that Brunei citizens receive the basics, we mean a house and a car, both of which are subsidised with loans at very low rates. They also receive free healthcare and dental care, free education and old age pensions. Even funerals are subsidised by the government. Of course, don't be fooled by thinking that the health and education are high quality. The government keeps a tight purse. It's a question of incentives. The more money you have left over, the more money goes into your pocket. I mean, to be fair, this description may not be technically accurate, but in practice, this is pretty much how things work in Brunei. We are talking about a country in which citizens have become highly dependent on state revenues, and therefore on whatever the Sultan wants to give them, but whose standard of living is nowhere near that of developed countries. And, as the saying goes, there is no such thing as a free lunch. And in Brunei's case, the trade-off is freedom, human rights, and social mobility. Unless, of course, you happen to have the good fortune to be born into the wealthier upper classes that maintain close ties, very close ties, with the royal house. And that is what explains headlines like this found in 2019.
Brunei's new penal code would enshrine, quote, cruel and inhumane punishments, UN rights chief warns. United Nations News.
So, what on earth is happening now with politics in Brunei so that even the UN itself, which typically looks the other way in political issues, is jumping up and down and sounding all the alarms? What are the evils that are so serious that the Sultanate has decided to punish them in a cruel and inhumane way? Well, let's see.
Islamism, vice, and hypocrisy.
Brunei is a Muslim majority country. Approximately 3 out of every 4 inhabitants are Muslim. The rest are a mixture of Christian, Buddhist, and indigenous beliefs. But despite the fact that 1 in 4 people is not Muslim, since 2014 the country has introduced reforms and punishments from Islamic law, the Sharia, to its penal code. It was an idea that came to Sultan Hassanal at the end of the 90s, and that most of his citizens kind of didn't think was all that bad. Although, seeing how things work here, it looks like their opinion wouldn't have mattered basically at all. So my friends, do you want to know more about evil ideas? Well, if so, then hold on to your seat. Because the reforms that began to be implemented in 2014 were completed in April 2019. They stipulate, for example, that consensual sexual relations between men carry the death penalty by stoning. Those between women are punishable by up to 40 lashes with a stick or 10 years in prison, and amputation of limbs has been imposed for thieves, starting with the right hand and continuing with the left foot if they re-offend. In other words, in 2019, the Sultanate of Brunei completed what amounts to the strict establishment of Sharia law throughout the entire country, in an environment in which no neighbouring Muslim country has established capital penalties for this type of behaviour. In this way, Brunei has become the only country in Southeast Asia to impose a strict version of Islamic law in the style of Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, or Iran. Of course, to date, Brunei has not yet applied the death penalty for any of these cases, and in fact has not executed anyone since 1957, when the country was still a British protectorate. But the fact that they have added Sharia law to the penal code sends out a dangerous warning. The power of the Sultan is above all else, and he will continue to be the guarantor of the purity of Islam and the application of its law in the most fundamentalist version possible. But hold on just one moment, because given all of these rules, I'm sure many of you are thinking, okay, if the Sultan is so devoted to Islam, then he should also live as the Islamic tradition and rules dictate, right? Well, it will come as a surprise to none of you that no, not really. In fact, he seems to do quite the opposite. A religious figure being hypocritical? Surely not. It's not only because his luxurious way of life and his flaunted wealth run contrary to the humility that Islam promulgates, but also because of his personal behaviour. You see, both Hassanal and his brother Jeffrey have a lifestyle that's a bit, how can we put this? Controversial? As controversial as it is notorious throughout the world. For For example, there are many women who have claimed to have been part of a kind of personal harem of the Sultan's brother, with dozens of them housed within the palace compound itself and semi-confined, without being able to communicate with the outside world at all. These are women who, on many occasions, also, surprise surprise, had relations with the Sultan himself. In fact, Gillian Lauren, one of the former harem girls, tells of her experience in her book Some Girls, where she recounts how her life was in these parts and how the girls were used and discarded at will. Listen up.
They have more money than anyone else. I know that they both, the Sultan and Jeffrey, have been married and divorced multiple times. It's really hypocritical. Gillian Lauren.
And of course, she's right. While the Sultan of Brunei also imposes the death penalty by stoning for adultery, he and his brother have been running wild parties with dozens, hundreds of Western women for years. In fact, another woman, Shannon Marketic, Miss United States 1992, don't you know? She went so far as to denounce the Sultan in a court in the United States, which eventually dismissed the complaint due to his immunity as a head of state. However, the case did help to make her story famous, in which she related, for example, that she accepted a job in Brunei for $3,000 a day that ended up being as a sort of semi-slave for the Sultan's brother Jeffrey and for the Sultan himself.
It is a great pleasure to welcome my good friend, His Majesty the Sultan of Brunei.
But don't think for 1 second that these two characters are the only partygoers involved in scandals. Scandals that almost always end with, let's say, an unethical waste of money. Another brother of the Sultan, Mohammed Bolkiah, who allegedly detested Hassan al Jeffrey's wastefulness, received a settlement of $2 billion, no questions asked, when he ceased to be Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2015. But I mean, who's not going to shelve their disgust for $2 billion? But just remember though, he really hates waste. The fact is that the opulence of the royal family and their behaviour, which is totally opposed to the teachings of Islam, make them probably one of the most hypocritical governments on the international stage today. And think about what kind of a statement that is. But not only that, if we add the social stagnation due to the country's rentier model, the lack of freedoms, the breaches of basic human rights, and a royal family bathed in wealth, vice, and hypocrisy, what we end up with is modern Brunei. But now it's over to you. What do you think of this curious system whereby liberticidal laws are applied to citizens but not to royalty? Will Brunei be able to move forward while such a large part of its hydrocarbon revenue goes directly to the royal household? And will I ever get more followers on Instagram? So, we really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit a like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. If you hit the little alarm button down there, you'll get updates whenever we release new content. Don't forget to check out our friends as well at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not my dulcet tones. And if you like that kind of thing, you can check out my podcast. It's called Making Europe Grants Again, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And, as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.